Sandi Kofol is joining me from Ljubljana in Slovenia, where he's a psychologist and a psychotherapist. Sandi's also a certified practitioner in logosynthesis, and he is going to talk to us today about his work. So thank you for joining me, Sandi. I look forward to this conversation.
Hi, Cathy. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, my work is, I do two things. I'm a psychotherapist. I do the counseling with people which have problems in their life. This is one part of my professional life, and the other part is doing workshops about communication and leadership in different companies in Slovenia. About communication, stress, and how to lead people and so on. So these are my two main area of work.
So I can see application for logosynthesis in both of those, because I know that presentations are a big source of stress for people, and logosynthesis does offer some amazing shifts.
Yeah. Yes, and also especially with the private topics, but also in the other area when doing coaching with, for example, leaders or not non-leaders. It's very useful, logosynthesis, as a tool, as a modality to work with different issues which people have at home and in the company, at workplace.
Yeah, they do overlap. So I'm always interested in learning how people were first introduced to logosynthesis and what made them curious to explore it. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
My colleague Tina Boncina introduced me into logosynthesis. She made a presentation about logosynthesis in 2015 or 14. And I went there and I found the logosynthesis interesting. I didn't understand well how it worked, but it was interesting. And then Tina brought the founder of logosynthesis, Willem Lamers, in 2015 in Ljubljana, where he did with her the basic of logosynthesis, and I was one of attendees, and so I learned how to use it and start to use it with my clients and also in my life, slowly, but almost every day now. And then I discovered very, very fastly that logosynthesis is very useful. And then I decided to learn more about it. So I started to read Willem's books. Then I had an opportunity to do the PETS, other workshops with Willem in Italy. It was very good for me because I could hear the same topic twice, because he explained it in English and then the translator translated into Italian, and I understand Italian, and so it was very good for me because Slovene is my native language, and so it was easier to comprehend and to be really in touch with logosynthesis.
Yeah, there's such a large international community, isn't there, with so many languages? So yeah.
And then I decided to become a practitioner. Now I finished the courses about master practitioner, and now I have to do the final exam or colloquium and write a little bit about my process. So this is my connection with logosynthesis.
That's great. Yeah. Always an interesting journey. So interesting to see where it leads. So today I wanted to take a bit of time just to talk about mental imagery and emotional distress. So the logosynthesis basic procedure offers a very precise and repeatable technique that shifts or resolves or eliminates mental imagery for immediate and sustained results. And so I've been reviewing some of the medical literature on mental imagery, and it offers a different path to relieving this emotional distress associated with mental health issues and PTSD compared to the more common method of changing thought processes. So a lot of times people really struggle with the cognitive thought processes because they can only get so far with the head, whereas when you work with the mental imagery, it's a bit different. So can you talk to that?
Yes, my experiences with clients before I met the logosynthesis was that very often people understand a lot about what's going on with them. They really understand why they feel what they feel and so on. But very often just knowing what is going on, it's not enough to relieve the stress. And I was looking for a technique, tool, modality where we can also relieve this stress. And the logosynthesis is very, very useful for this. I think that this mental imagery is very useful concept because in logosynthesis we have this personal space which we try to discover what is going on in it. And when we talk about these images, which are not only connected with the visual system, but also with our audio and kinesthetic and olfactory and gustatory. This is very useful because when we learn how to explore our personal space, and when we know that, okay, in logosynthesis language these are frozen energy, but they are just imagery. They are just we don't know. I don't know how is this connected with the things in our brains, but I think that we should do some researches about it and to then explain what's going on. But the practice, our practice with clients and also ourselves show us that with logosynthesis we can really address these imageries with logosynthesis.
Yeah, and so when I kind of read the research, there are techniques that are being used to address the mental imagery. So there is recognition that the mental imagery can cause re-experiencing of a traumatic event. So in that moment, when something is triggered and you end up re-experiencing that traumatic event, right?
This is very important because with logosynthesis, we don't need to go to re-experience the, for example, trauma once again. We come just a little bit in touch, and then we address the trigger with the logosynthesis. So this is it's not so painful for the client, because if I remember working with my clients before knowing logosynthesis, I remember how many times the client should explain me the things that happened during the trauma situation. And with logosynthesis, it's much easier. Sometimes it's not funny, but it's very interesting that sometimes we don't have to know what happened. We just know that something happened which was painful, and we can just give a metaphor for what happened. We don't need to search, explore for exact thing, you know. And so yeah, this is very important. We don't need to re-traumatize the client again.
Yeah, and the procedure is, I mean, the basic procedure has such an elegant process to it, because a lot of times those memories, that mental imagery can be hidden, that we're not even cognitively aware of it. So quite often someone comes in with an issue and they say, oh, I know what's causing it. So there are such, there is that intrusive mental imagery that people can associate the emotional distress with. But on the other hand, there's also the emotional distress where there isn't an awareness of what that mental imagery is. And in both processes, logosynthesis works to identify and shift that energy in it to relieve it. Yeah.
Yes. And also in comparison, for example, with some other techniques or modalities, when the clients, I don't know, when they have negative thoughts or negative mental images or memories, and we discuss with other techniques we discuss about it, and then we decide to start to look at this thing from, for example, positive way of looking. But sometimes it works, but very often I had experience that it doesn't work because two parts were still present. The old part, which was not addressed with or relieved, and okay, the new part, which is important, but they are in the fight, the new and the old part. And with logosynthesis, we can resolve this old part. And then, yes, of course, we also talk about how to start to look at the same thing from new point of view. But from my experience, it's very important to relieve the old part, the trigger, the situation which causes the pain or the distress in client's life.
Yeah, and quite often once that old part is resolved or shifted, then people don't even really have to think about the new part, because it just shows up, right? Like then their energy is available. And so
Yes.
quite often people they might not even notice that something has shifted. And then later upon thinking about it, it's like, well, that person that always bothered me doesn't bother me anymore. Or they'll attribute a different reason as to why the situation has gone away, but the situation has gone away.
Yes. These are also my experience with logosynthesis. Yes. Well, it depends on the topic. Depends how many of homework we say the person did. But yes, when we did our homework, when we did a lot of work with the frozen energy and these negative memories and so on, then yes, we relive it, and then we forget that it was there once, and we just live. We say in logosynthesis, our mission, we can go on our path with more energy, with different way of feeling, thinking, and acting.
Yeah, and we work layer by layer. So sometimes an issue is like one cycle, it's one very vivid image, and when it's resolved, it's resolved. And then there are other situations, especially if it relates to childhood issues, where there may have been repeated
Yes.
incidents and lots of layers. And that is the same process, but different level or different amount of mental imagery. Can you talk to
Yes.
that?
Yes. I think more things are important here about this topic. The first very important thing is that the working alliance which we have with the client is also very, very important in logosynthesis. And yes, when we have very good or strong working alliance with the client, we can do also more layers in a session, or sometimes we can go directly to the layer which is very low, so to the experience from the childhood, for example. But this is just possible when the working alliance is very strong, when the client trusts the guide. And I also think that very important is that the guide is in connection with essence. It's okay with himself or herself. But on the other hand, when we have a client which is new, which, for example, comes for the first time in contact with me as a guide or with the logosynthesis, yes, we start very slowly and we start with the layer which is on the surface. So the client has to have this experience that we can change a little piece of thing which affects his or her life. And then slowly in next sessions, we can go deeper. But we also have to know that we just work with things which clients wants to work on it. So I don't believe it's good that I don't know, we got a client and then we want to go deep because we want to go, not the clients. So we always start and work with what clients brings into the session. Yes, of course, we can share with him or her our thoughts about things that the client explains us, but the client is the criteria.
Yeah, and I think
where to
that's
go.
an important point when you talk to, because it's so important that we do our own work as a guide, because quite often our desire is to help someone and to fix their problems, right? And so especially when we know that this is something that can help. And Willem is always very adamant that slow, lazy, stupid. And I certainly see the value in that, because then we allow the client to bring it forward on their pace. And especially when it is mental imagery that is so intense that comes to the surface, that may have been tucked away and out of awareness for a very long time, then it's important that those layers are resolved at the client's pace. And sometimes that's fast and sometimes it's not so fast. But what I notice is that people that have been living for a very long time without hope, thinking that there was no way they could move beyond these emotions, now have hope that it can one day be resolved. So that's very different for them.
Yes, yes. This is very important, yes, what you said. Doing our work is also very important, because I think that it's not good to take the client somewhere where we weren't before, him or her there. So we have to know what's there, because holding the space for the client, it's one part, but then then inviting him or her to go a little bit further, which which means going into the contact with the pain, with the trigger. It could be very painful, and so we have to know what's there, how is being there, and also it's important that we had good experience with resolving our issues. This doesn't mean that we cannot work with the issues which we hadn't have in our life, but being in contact with our issues, resolving them, and had this feeling that we're okay, that we are there to be with client. This is very, very important. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes when those sentences are processing, so you think, oh, I'm going to offer 3 sentences and that's going to shift the image. But when the client says those 3 sentences and the words shift the energy, there can be some very intense emotions and physical sensations that the client experienced during that process. And trusting that once the processing is complete, the issue is resolved. But it is asking a lot for the client to go there. And I find a lot of times, because people know that if they do go there and they can have hope that it will be resolved, as opposed to, quite often their prior experience may have been going for therapy where they've talked about the issue and it comes back, and they talk about the issue and it comes back, and so in some sense, although there's layer after layer, it's not like the layers are always repeating the same thing. It's working with different levels of imagery.
Yes, different levels of imagery, and also one image could have different parts, and when sometimes it looks from outside like a miracle when we can address with logosynthesis the whole image, and the effect is quite a miracle. But sometimes we cannot address the whole image. We can look piece by piece, and sometimes we have to use more sessions to work with one imagery, especially memories, traumas, which were, as you said, many times repeated, or were from the very early part of client's life, or it was very intensive for the client, or unexpected, and so on. So sometimes I because my clients tell to other people about good experiences with logosynthesis, some clients come and expect that we can resolve things always very fast. But no, first we have to make this working alliance, and then we have to see what is really triggering the person, and sometimes we can go we have to go slowly, as William says, slowly.
Are there situations that you find that maybe there's more energy bound, more emotional distress, more physical distress? Are there certain types of situations that come to mind for you that
how do you mean
that can be very intense? So for some of us going through everyday life where we haven't had really specific traumatic experiences, then we're like, well, I don't see what the big deal is about it, or we just can't appreciate what the other person is experiencing because we haven't been there. But there are situations that can be very intense.
Yes, as from my experiences, especially the situations from people's life which are connected with abuse, assaults, um, um, and also on the other hand with losing important people in their lives, and from my experiences, these are very are situations which are very connected with high level of distress with clients. Probably because these topics are also in the society very are interpreted as very strong, and maybe also because of this. Because on the other hand, I also have clients which have problems which are, for example, for many people very small, but in case for this, if for this client this is very painful, we have to take it as it's very painful, but statistically, yes, abuse, assaults, especially losing children, which is then connected with grief and loss, are usually statistically topics which are very intense.
And I think that's an
yes.
important point too, because I just know even in my life, I did a workshop once, and it was let's kind of assess it. It was with the teachers, and they were experienced stress at work, right? And so we did a group of 10, and everybody had the opportunity to express what was bothering them. And then our automatic response is to jump in with advice. And so as soon as somebody explains what's bothering them, oh, I know exactly what you're feeling. This is what you can do. And yet they were able to see, using the logosynthesis protocol, they were able to go around and what that underlying mental imagery, what the underlying experience was that was actually triggering that stress may have had nothing to do, because it is quite right, like those memories, although there's themes that we freeze our energy around, it's all very unique experiences. If we all show up at the same accident, we may all freeze a different memory that may trigger our distress. And so, automatically we like to offer what our advice is, but that isn't necessarily what the mental imagery is underlying. So
yes, and we also can't leave out also the importance of, for example, generational effect, because someone who has in his or her field experience of, for example, I don't know, his grandfather losing someone, I believe that this person will differently feel the loss in his life than a person which does not have this experience or this field from the from transgenerational thing. So yes, it's very important to see what are all these things that make an impact on the this imagery.
And again, that transgenerational isn't something that's necessarily in our cognitive awareness, right? It's not something that we can necessarily pull up and say, oh, I know exactly because, my grandmother
Yes.
lost a child, that this is, but when we use logosynthesis, especially with a strong working alliance, we identify what it is that, what are our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations. The imagery arises when we're in contact with our emotional distress. It's not that we're thinking our way to find that imagery. When we're in contact with the thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations, and we allow ourselves to feel it and to feel the distress, the imagery arises. And having
Yes.
someone
Yes.
trained in logosynthesis is so important to know how to guide that process. Because I think a lot of times when we start trying to support someone who's in distress, we open a lot of things up, and then it's what do we do with it all? Whereas with logosynthesis, it's so specific on the presenting issue.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you. And logosynthesis is very useful for this kind of work.
Do you have
And
any examples of working with someone?
I have a lot of examples. I have to think about them and not to explain them too much because of the client's
Yeah.
fidelity.
Yeah.
I can remember, for example, case where a client came with totally different issue, but during our work we came to the topic which was connected with his grandfather during the Second World War. And we didn't come to this topic just talking about it. We had to do a lot of layers. We have to resolve a lot of layers to come there. But the main point was that a lot of frozen energy was in this grandfather's field of this client. Or maybe I can share my experience. For example, I did a work with William this year. With my experience being stuck somewhere, I had this feeling that I'm stuck. And then we came to the imagery of me lying in the hospital during the war. I wasn't in war in my life. And when we resolved this image, this representation, I felt totally different, because before of this, I felt immobilized. So I really felt like I was lying in the hospital, hurt, immobilized. And
it's a lot of it is metaphor, right? Like it's a representation. I'm reading the book, The Matter of Things with Ian McGilchrist, and it's about, the left hemisphere of the brain, right hemisphere of the brain. And he talks about things that we can't make sense of necessarily in parts, but we have these metaphors that kind of represent a whole. And so again, with logosynthesis, we don't analyze the images that show up and say, oh, that doesn't make sense, Sandi. That can't possibly have happened. We say this is what the energy structure is, and we say the sentences on it. And again,
or maybe I can remember a case with a client which had really, really high distress about one situation as a child. And then when we try to discover her personal space and her body and so on, she had experienced that she has a big tube in her mouth. And when we did the logosynthesis, a lot of things changed.
Mhm.
My idea is that this tube was really connected with sexual abuse, because
Yeah,
I think it was there, but the client didn't have to know what happened, and the
right,
things change.
right. Yeah,
And this is very important, that very often with logosynthesis we really don't have to analyze a lot. Well, we talk about things, but we don't have to analyze in details. And
yeah. And
so
sometimes, even when working with someone, an image can show up and you can tell that someone has connected with, you know, a very vivid movie, a very vivid image, a very intense sound. You can tell that they're in that space. And with logosynthesis, they don't even have to explain it all out. Like normally we would ask to get that label to be precise with the
yes,
mental imagery, but we can also say this image in front of me, or this perception, or and use that as a label, and the client is in
yes,
contact with it, so the energy does shift.
mhm,
And that's another aspect. Again, it's you know, it's all the aspects that are so important in the training program, I guess, right? Because
yes,
it can be so powerful to have an understanding of what can come up in the work.
yes. And for us as guides, it's also very important that we just see these all issues of clients just as frozen energy. It's much easier.
Yeah,
And when you cannot see the issues of our clients just as frozen energy, then we have a homework to do. So we have to see what is triggering us
yeah,
in all these stories. And of course, this is never-ending story. I believe that we would have for the whole of our life to resolve something, but
yeah,
slowly, day after day, using logosynthesis, my experiences are that I'm less and less triggered with client stories. But this doesn't mean that I'm not, how is the right word, empathic or
yeah. Compassionate. Yeah,
compassionate. Yeah.
and the thing is, we always say, you know, it's not you're not reacting to you're not as reactive to your client's story. It's not triggering those automatic reactions for you
Mhm.
because you've done your work. But your energy is then available to be more compassionate, to be more present. So your
Mhm.
energy is more available to you.
Mhm.
And I know, like for me, I don't, I have aphantasia. I just learned recently, right? So aphantasia is when you don't have mental visual images, or don't hear sounds, and it's
Mhm.
only like less than 5% of the population that has this condition. But I know that there's several people in the logosynthesis community, and one of the things is when you don't see those images, you still have you know, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their definition of mental imagery, even if you don't have the awareness of mental visual images, you
Mhm.
still have those sensory representations. So it's still under the umbrella of mental imagery. Um, but it's not as vivid. And so again, there's
Yes.
research that's out there that relates the vividness of mental imagery. And some people, which they call hyperphantasia, some people have very vivid mental images.
Yeah.
And with that, there's an association with very intense emotions. And you see that sometimes working with people as well, right?
Yes. Yes. It's useful for all of them. And yes, we are in this continuum from uh, hyper uh, hyper to a phantasic
Yeah.
people. Yeah. Um,
And
Yes, and
logosynthesis works with all of them. So
yes, and and we can be creative also with people who cannot really, who really doesn't have a lot of this vivid mental imagery, but we can say, imagine how it would be if you could see something. Imagine also the imagination of something. It could be a trigger for somewhere, and then we can work with this, and also with this mapping, and or sometimes it's very useful to use I don't know, pictures which people draw as things to use Logosynthesis on it, you know?
yeah.
Or the
Yeah, and even just saying what comes to mind. So sometimes something will come to mind for me that's not in the form of a picture or a voice, but it's an internal dialogue. It's a story. So the situation comes up. I just don't have the same type of representation, but there still is a representation that may have been below my awareness that arises. So yeah.
Yes. I also had my personal experience that at the beginning I had really a lot of difficulties to imagine something, but then with training, with using Logosynthesis, now I have this a lot more of imagery. But this doesn't mean that I see the things really vividly, but I have idea. Yes, there is something. There is this smell, there is this picture, there is this idea of something sometimes also.
Yeah. Oh. Well, that's great, Sandi. I am curious if you have a key message that you would like to leave us with about, from your background as a psychologist, psychotherapist, working with, people at work, working with people in distress. What would a key message be?
That for, this is now I'm 45, and maybe I will see the things differently after 5 years or 10. But now I think that it's very important that we don't see our lives just through our bodies and our mind, but also through some spiritual part of ourselves. So I think that here is Logosynthesis theory, and it's very important that gives us also this part of spirituality, not just looking at people as body or mind, not just looking at people how which their needs are, feelings are, and so on, but also what is our mission, what is our path, what is important for us, and also for something bigger. So this is one of these key messages from my experiences, and very important is having this feeling to be in touch with our essence, not just be in touch with our control of, for example, needs and wishes and life and so on, but also be this feeling to be in contact with, to be part of essence. Yeah.
And that's such a beautiful comment, because logosynthesis, the basic procedure, the technique is so simple that you don't need to, know all the theory in order for it to work. And logosynthesis is such a elegant spiritual model that regardless what faith you may follow, what religious practice you may follow, or whether you don't follow one, you can still find your essence in there, you can still make contact and fit it within your religious path or your spiritual path. So
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful model that way. And yeah, however, you know, I'm always intrigued because I always say I would be the least likely person to be interested in logosynthesis because I wasn't overly in touch with my emotions, or I was just, you know, busy working hard and powering on. And yet there was just something there that sparked my curiosity, and it was an inner question mark, right? It wasn't like somebody told me I had to do this. It was an inner curiosity that life didn't have to be so hard, or that I didn't have to struggle so much to get things done, that type of thing. So I think that's a really important point. Thank you. Yeah. Any final word?
Final word.
Because I just interrupted your key message with my final word.
Yeah,
So now I'll let you have one.
I think it's important to give ourselves opportunity to try and to try logosynthesis, because usually it works, and the worst thing that can happen is that it doesn't work for someone. But my advice is that you wait a little bit, because sometimes we, after a day or two or after a week, discover that something changed during the use of logosynthesis. And life is much easier when we have logosynthesis, as William often says, with metaphor. So to use logosynthesis as a toothbrush for the everyday's triggers is a very useful approach in life.
That is great. I back that comment 100%. So thank you. Well, thank you, Sandi. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to sharing it.
Thank you, Cathy.